Welcome to ILTV Security Brief. I'm Calev Ben-David. Each week, we focus on the latest developments in security and defense relating to Israel and the Middle East, impacting on this region and beyond. And we start with our top items of the past week. IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir says the Army knows how to capture Gaza City after the cabinet approves plans for a new offensive into the Hamas stronghold as the first step in taking over all of Gaza. Zamir adds the IDF will do everything to protect the lives of the hostages and bring them home. Amid growing concern, the operation could endanger those who are still alive. The IDF releases document evidence it says shows that Anas al-Sharif, an Al Jazeera correspondent killed in an airstrike in Gaza on August 10th with 4 other workers for the channel, was also a Hamas terror cell leader who directed rocket attacks against Israel. Journalist groups condemn his killing and call on Israel to allow foreign media free access into Gaza. IDF forces operating in the Tranja area of southern Syria capture a weapons dealer and seize his arms cache as part of ongoing operations to prevent Hezbollah and other terror groups from establishing bases of operations along the Golan Border. And now our big story. Prime Minister Netanyahu held rare press briefings for both foreign and local media this week to clarify the strategy in Gaza approved by the Security Cabinet. Israel seeks not to annex or occupy Gaza, he told journalists, but to free it from Hamas control. That means the IDF gaining full control of the Strip by taking over the remaining 25% that remain Hamas strongholds, starting with an operation in Gaza City that may take several months and requires massive call-up of hundreds of thousands of reservists. But it does run the risk of increased casualties among the troops, endangering the remaining hostages, and intensifying international pressure on Israel, stirred up by what Netanyahu called a, quote, campaign of lies over the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Here's Netanyahu.
The war can end tomorrow if Gaza, or rather if Hamas lays down its arms and releases all the remaining hostages. Gaza will be demilitarized. Israel will have overriding security responsibility. A security zone will be established on Gaza's border with Israel to prevent future terrorist incursions. A civilian administration will be established in Gaza that will seek to live in peace with Israel. 5 principles for concluding the war. 1, Hamas disarmed. 2nd, all hostages freed. 3rd, Gaza demilitarized. 4th, Israel has overriding security control. And 5, non-Israeli peaceful civilian administration. Hamas's refusal to lay down its arms. Israel has no choice but to finish the job and complete the defeat of Hamas. Israel's Security Cabinet instructed the IDF to dismantle the 2 remaining Hamas strongholds in Gaza City and the central camps. Contrary to false claims, this is the best way to end the war and the best way to end it speedily.
And joining us now for more on these and other issues is Benjamin Anthony, co-founder and CEO of the MirYam Institute. Benjamin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Before we start breaking down this plan into its sort of components, now that we've got a little more detail about what the government intends, I want to get your reaction to it, your response to what Netanyahu presented.
Well, I'm actually rather appalled by what the Prime Minister presented, because in my mind, it's fighting Hamas since October the 7th, since the massacre they launched against our people, to nothing more than a return to the status quo with some minor adjustments. For example, the Prime Minister saying he wants a perimeter around the Gaza Strip from north to east to south. OK, that perimeter will be about 1 kilometer in depth, maybe 2 kilometers at its deepest point, and will also hold the Rafah crossing, which we should have held anyway. There's no Arab leadership that is waiting in the wings to take custodianship over the people of Gaza. What ought to have been pursued and what ought to have been pressed and what ought to have been muscularly promoted diplomatically is the relocation and the facilitation of the relocation of the Gazan people out of the Gaza Strip to absorbing countries. That's not been done. It's left us in this terrible quandary, and I find what the Prime Minister is promoting here to be absolutely unsatisfactory. Not for this did we lose 1,000 soldiers. Not for this have so many families fallen apart, businesses fallen apart, widows come about, orphans come about. You fight this enemy to win. You fight them to destroy the enemy. And as long as the Gazans are hard on the borders with the State of Israel, Hamas will be able to replenish its ranks. That's the truth of the matter.
Right. Now, we do know, though, there are some reports, even today, Israeli officials talking with some countries, including the Sudanese, Sudan, about maybe doing it. But who we're not hearing that from now, crucially, is the Americans. President Trump initially spoke about a plan that had that component in it. So did Steve Witkoff. But we haven't really heard anything like that of Washington. What could that be a factor that the U.S. no longer is behind that sort of concept going into Gaza?
Well, I think the U.S. can't be more strident about pursuing a plan than Israel itself. President Trump put forward a very clear vision. There are many naysayers about this war and this campaign that express there has been absolutely no long-term political vision put forward. That is not true. We all heard President Trump put forward an alternative to the nonsensical, in my opinion, two-state solution, and he called it the redevelopment of the Gaza Strip. He expressed it, he repeatedly doubled down on it, but the Prime Minister of Israel and our leadership never really got behind it. They've paid some lip service to it here and there. For example, during Prime Minister Netanyahu's most recent trip to Washington, D.C., he spoke about it, but it hasn't been pursued with great vigor. And I don't think anyone can expect an American president to pursue that policy with greater vigor than an Israeli Prime Minister. Bibi has not done that, and I don't find it satisfactory at all.
Right, but what would be the vision of Gaza following that? As part of that, again, there was a time when President Trump was talking about almost sort of making it an American, I don't know if you would say protectorate or something, but what would they say? The U.S. seems to have backed down from that, whether for whatever reason or not. What would the future of Gaza would be under that kind of plan?
Well, I think the thing to watch is what would be the future of Israel and our security. And I want to go back to what I just mentioned. In my estimation, having served inside the Gaza Strip, as have so many other Israelis during the course of this war, many of whom have done just what I did and a great deal beyond, I can tell you that I am absolutely convinced that as long as you have the Gazans, however palatable or unpalatable this may be to say, as long as you have them on the borders with the State of Israel, the vision for the future of the State of Israel is that it will be living on its sword in danger of another October 7th. It's from among the Gazans that Hamas will replenish their ranks. It's the Gazan people who cheered and chanted and celebrated Hamas as they brought our kidnapped, elderly, infirm, young and old, our dead soldiers, and paraded them with their entrails hanging out through the streets of Gaza. It's the Gazans who cheered that as Hamas carried out those horrors. Those people cannot be left proximate to our borders. I'm sorry. And if somebody is a fan of the Gazans, for example, if somebody says, well, we have to think about what's in the best interest of the Gazan people, I again go back to my service and what I saw serving along the Netzarim corridor. The Gaza Strip is uninhabitable. If somebody is a fan of the Gazans, they should not want the Gazans living there either. I don't want the Gazans there. If people are sympathetic to the Gazans, they should not want the Gazans living there. I know what I saw inside Gaza. It's correct, appropriate, justifiable. The level of destruction inside the Gaza Strip, it was a necessary aspect of this war. But anybody who thinks that the world is doing the Gazans a favor by keeping them where they are is completely detached from reality.
Well, you speak about the world. There has been international pressure even at this stage, and it risen dramatically just in the last couple of weeks with the recognition of Palestine by, of course, Canada and some of the Western European countries. How would Israel deal with that, both from these countries, some of them who have been supplying arms with Israel, and now that's being cut back, and also, of course, for example, Arab countries, it's those it has treaties with, Jordan, Egypt, and of course, the Abraham Accords countries.
Yeah, so let me speak a bit about the international community, if I may. In times of a massive displacement of a population, the international community has a very clear 1-2 combination that it throws almost axiomatically. It implores neighbouring and non-neighbouring states to absorb the displaced. And when the displaced are absorbed, the international community promptly applauds them. That's the convention. We saw it, for example, to give the viewers an idea of this, in Syria. Nearly 6 million Syrians have been absorbed by neighbouring, in this case Turkey, and non-neighbouring, for example, Germany, states since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. In the case of Ukraine, 5 million Ukrainians have been absorbed by neighbouring Poland, non-neighbouring Israel. at the behest of the international community and then at the celebration of the international community. Uniquely, however, only in the case of the Gazans are we told that any country that absorbs these displaced people, who incidentally are displaced as a consequence of the immiseration caused by their own leadership, Hamas, we are told uniquely that this displaced people, anyone who absorbs them, is guilty and complicit of ethnic cleansing, and that they, the Gazans themselves, uniquely want to stay exactly where they are in these appallingly difficult conditions, again, brought upon them by themselves and by their own leadership. So the international community, if it's so very concerned, let it act according to its own long-standing conventions. Absorb the Gazans into your own population, beginning, incidentally, with one of the countries that is absolutely, massively responsible for what happened on October 7th. I'm referring to Egypt. Egypt is eminently well-resourced to absorb the Gazans into the Sinai Peninsula, and from there, they can move on to various parts of Africa, which I believe is what Sisi would do anyway. Sisi wouldn't allow Egypt to be displaced. Sisi should be pressured by the Americans to absorb the Gazans into the Sinai Peninsula as a starting point. Israel cannot leave this threat on our borders. I know it's not palatable to say, but I cannot remain silent
right, but it's also a question of whether it's even realistic to say. And as of now, we don't see those countries doing it. So I want to then go back to this operation, because you have served in Gaza during this war. Talk about what you see, though, as the result of Israel carrying out this operation, for example, starting in Gaza City, if we do see it, rather than, for example, it leading to some kind of hostage deal or renewed negotiations.
Well, this could be a return to the long-standing tactic here of Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he essentially flexes his military muscles in the hope of getting some diplomatic outcome in order to avert a military conflict. So as an example of that, massing hundreds of thousands, potentially, of IDF reservists on the borders with the Gaza Strip, expressing that we're about to go into Gaza City, we're about to take out this last stronghold, as the Prime Minister describes it, and hoping that that will drive Hamas back to the negotiating table. We've been told that Prime Minister Netanyahu has adjusted his doctrine on negotiations, saying that only a deal that brings all of the hostages, the 20 living and the 30 who are no longer alive, back in one go is a deal in which he is interested. That's a major shift. But I think you're going to see more international opprobrium. I think you're going to see a heavier burden on the soldiers. I do think we're up to it if we're deployed forward and asked to undertake this task. But it leaves the domestic conversation here in Israel really at a white-hot state, namely the recurring drafting of the reservists time and again is something that needs to change. One way to do that, start drafting the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community.
All right. Well, there's a lot of ifs there, and the challenges politically for Prime Minister Netanyahu, and a lot of these suggestions. But of course, we don't know how these things are going to develop in the coming months. I want to move to somewhere else in the region now. Some other interesting developments. Lebanon's government has made a potentially game-changing decision, with President Michal Aoun's cabinet approving a U.S. proposal that calls for disarming Hezbollah by year's end. Now, the plan would also see Israel withdraw from its forward positions in Lebanon, and negotiations to resolve all border issues between the countries. The U.S. ambassador to Turkey and envoy to Syria, Tom Barak, who's handling the Lebanon file, praised what he called a historic, bold, and correct decision by the Lebanese government. But Hezbollah made clear it will not play along. Its allied ministers boycotted the cabinet vote, and the Iranian security chief Ali Laranjani touched down in Beirut yesterday to coordinate strategy against the plan. Now, here's the assessment of Imad Salameh. He's a political scientist at Lebanese American University.
The decision of the government is historic and is a landmark decision, because Lebanon has been used to non-state armed actors since it exists. And, this is really a new effort by the Lebanese government to assert its sovereignty over all its territory. Now, whether this can happen and can be attained and achieved, it's a different story. Of course, Lebanese are divided on this matter. Some, particularly the Shia community, and that reside in the south, in the Bekaa Valley, in the southern district of Beirut in particular, as well as Beirut as a whole. They have a concern that once this weapons has been pulled out, then the community will be vulnerable to Israeli aggressions, and there will be no means to deter Israeli from turning South Lebanon into another West Bank or another Gaza.
And we should mention, Benjamin, you also have served in Lebanon during the Second Lebanon War. You have experience with Lebanon. You hear one of the results of that war was supposed to be these sort of guarantees of Hezbollah, for example, pulling back from the border with Israel. Now we're talking about disarming Hezbollah. How realistically do you see that happening under this proposal?
Well, look, it's progress of a kind, right? The idea that we've moved exactly as you've just described, from moving Hezbollah back to now laying down their weapons, is a positive thing. I personally think that, again, what went on in southern Lebanon is emblematic of my objections to what's going on in the Gaza Strip and what the Prime Minister stated there. During the war and prior to the war against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, it was stated very, very clearly that they would have to move back to beyond the Litani River.
Right.
Hezbollah would have to move back to beyond the Litani River, and there would be a buffer zone established between southern Lebanon and northern Israel. That hasn't happened. We have troops there enforcing the terms of the ceasefire, but we don't have a buffer zone that's established. Not for those terms did we enter into this war. I think there are some encouraging aspects about what's going on, namely, unlike in the Gaza Strip, Lebanon does actually have a leader, Joseph Aoun. Joseph Aoun is there saying that he demands that Hezbollah disarms and that the Lebanese armed forces become the only bearers of arms inside Lebanon. That's very distinct from Gaza, where you ask Hamas to lay down their arms. First of all, they don't want to do it. And secondly, there's nobody to take over the enforcement of the law and the governance there in the Gaza Strip. So people need to be aware of these differences and of these distinctions. But I am very disappointed that Israel has allowed the arrival of an Iranian agitator into Lebanon who's gone there specifically to scupper any effort to bring about quiet.
That's Ali Laranjani, who's now head of the National Security Council, really the security chief, allowed him to go. And what should Israel have done in this case?
Well, I think the man constitutes a direct threat to the security and the safety of the state of Israel. And post-October 7th, we're supposed to have had a doctrine shift where we don't allow that. We don't allow tents to be erected on our side of the border. We don't allow terrorists to establish themselves right on our border and give them the opportunity to penetrate our borders and move in towards our towns and our cities. And we should not be allowing the agitators against any notion of quiet between ourselves and Lebanon to come in and stir up the pot again. I think that it speaks to a lack of enforcement of our own doctrine that we tragically had to shift to post-October the 7th.
Right. And let's bring in Iran here in this case, because this is not the only issue with Iran that there have been some concerning developments. Reports that, perhaps not surprising, that Iran has already started to reconstitute its, or attempt to reconstitute its nuclear enrichment atomic enrichment, uranium enrichment program, along with other comments suggesting that it's even possible, security officials expressing concern that Iran could try to launch some kind of surprise attack at this stage as retaliation for the war in June. So I want to get your response, how Israel should be responding also to these developments, perhaps also not just Israel. Let's include the United States and the international community.
Well, I think firstly, the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, wherever they may be, ought to be fortifying their institutions across the board, the Jewish high schools.
You mean security measures?
Absolutely. The synagogues in the United States of America, many of which I know very, very well as a result of my work with the MirYam Institute, are simply too lax when it comes to their own security. Summer camps are too lax when it comes to their own security. Youth groups, community centers, you name it, they constitute soft targets for retaliation by the Iranian regime and by their proxies. So that's the first thing that ought to be done. In terms of the international community, there are some encouraging signs. The E3, for example, so that's Britain, France, Germany, have expressed in writing, so they've written a really strong letter, in other words, right, that they are going to move towards snapping back the sanctions that existed prior to the ratification of the JCPOA that was done under President Obama and then walked away from by President Trump during his first term. So there does seem to be, if there's a little bit of insanity and complete confusion, and dare I say good old-fashioned anti-Semitism when it comes to European countries and their attitudes towards Israel's actions in Gaza, there does seem to be just a little remnant of sanity when it comes to their concerns about Iran and it becoming a nuclear weapons regime again, a nuclear armed regime, in the future rather.
Right.
So that's a little bit of encouragement, but I think that everybody needs to stay very vigilant with regard to Iran. I don't believe that the Israelis have taken their eye off the ball with regard to Iran. I know the world media is looking at Gaza, but our defense establishment is very much looking at Iran as well, rightly so.
And how much is Syria a potential either ally to Israel in that front, or is the concerns over the Islamist elements in the new Syrian regime more of a concern, do you think? Should be more of a concern for Israel now?
Well, I think that Syria obviously has its own story with Hezbollah and so on, but I'm afraid I'm a complete skeptic on the notion that this al-Julani, who is a double-dyed terrorist,
also known as the president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara.
And whatever he may call him by, I will say what I see. And that individual is a double-dyed, clear terrorist, okay? He is somebody who has led terrorist organizations, terrorist movements. The fact that he's able to put on a suit and take on something of a more Western appearance does not cut the mustard with me. I think that he is a threat, and I think that his talk about coming to a security arrangement with the State of Israel is purely because he is operating from a position of profound weakness. We saw what he wanted to do with the Druze. We saw what he wanted to do with the Alawites. I don't think he has a place in his heart for the Zionists either.
So what should Israel, on a concrete level, be doing there?
I think Israel should be holding the territory that it took. When we saw Israel move when Assad fell, surprisingly, when Assad rather abruptly and swiftly fell and sought refuge inside Russia, Israel moved to demolish and destroy the remnants of the ammunitions that the Syrians had and to hold territory that ensured our topographical advantage and defensive viability. We should actually hold those areas, including the very peak of the Chilmon, which gives us an overview of the relevant terrain. All
right. Benjamin Anthony of the MirYam Institute, thank you for joining us on ILTV Security Brief.